Thank you very much, Gina. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I wish I had written that as well. And it's funny, I was actually going to start by saying I don't need to almost say any more because Gina's almost right. That's not the backbone of the infrastructure that largely supplies Dublin's water almost 200 years later. It is the backbone that still supplies Dublin's water 200 years later. And the vast majority of it has not been maintained. And it mentions the Bartry Tunnel, which has been in imminent danger of collapse since 1987, and no money has been invested in it. And I suppose that's at the heart of what I do want to talk about tonight. So, the question that's posed to the speakers this evening is, how do we ensure a water supply for future generations? And I suppose I would start by saying water supply is a utility. And a utility is a basic service that's fundamentally needed for the proper operation of an economy and a society. So like Gina says, I'm an engineer, and a bit frightening for myself, but I have 37 years' experience working in utilities, both in Ireland and internationally. So I guess I have some, at least modicum of experience and knowledge to talk a bit about what are the best utility engineering solutions to ensure our water supply for future generations. But I think, as we've learned in the last 18 months, the provision of water services is not solely or simply a utility engineering problem. It's an issue that raises fundamental questions of public policy. So your preferred solution for delivering this utility service depends on the kind of society that you want. And there are big questions here about what products and services are seen in our society simply as goods that we can buy and sell and we pay for as we use, and which services are seen as human rights and therefore simply not to be traded in the marketplace. And if we do deem something to be a human right, and to my mind access to clean water is a human right, then how do we fund it? Do we fund it through central taxation, or through user charges, or through a combination of both? There's a second really important issue, and that is that water is also a finite, precious natural resource. I grew up on a small farm in Mayo, and I learned absolutely the preciousness of land. And when I grew up, everyone said to me, Michael, they're not making any more land. But we're not making any more water either. The total volume of water on this planet is fixed and exists in our oceans, in our lakes, in our rivers, and in the frozen ice caps, which are now unfortunately less frozen at our polar regions. So, how do we fund this utility service? And how do we act responsibly in its use for today and future generations? These, to my mind, are questions of national policy. And it's for politicians to put forward their policy positions and for them to persuade the public to buy into those policy positions and to get support for that view. I am not a politician. As I'm reminded, I couldn't be a politician. I don't think I have the energy that these guys have. My job and my experience and my background and my responsibility is to run utilities and to run them well. And in the case of my job today, my responsibility is to run two national strategic infrastructure utilities, to run them well and to run them in line with government policy that is set by politicians. So I'm sure a lot of the other panellists this evening will talk about the political side of this and their views on government policy. I don't work for the government. I'm not a government representative, and I'm not here to speak for the government. I'm not here to either defend them or criticise them. I am here and will answer for Arvia and what we've done in terms of running the utilities, both our gas utility and our water utility. So while I've said I'm not a politician and I'm not into policy, I'd like to say maybe a couple of things at the outset on policy issues that are at stake here before I move on to matters that I do know a little bit about in terms of the engineering side of it. And I guess until recently, we had a different approach to the payment of our water services than any other country in the OECD. In every other OECD country, without exception, water services are paid for partly by funding through the public purse and partly by water charges levied on businesses and households for their use. Nobody in the other OECD countries objects to those payments. They accept it as a normal part of what they do. And even in Greece, where they have tremendous issues, they pay for their water services. So it is the norm for a modern society that you pay for your use as well as get support for an essential basic human need in terms of water services through the Exchequer. So we've not introduced something that's unusual or out of sync or out of step here in Ireland. However, it has to be recognised that the timing of the move to the introduction of water charges in Ireland was an issue, coming at a time of incredible austerity. It was easy to depict water charges as a byproduct of austerity and another tax imposed on a weary population. And absolutely, without doubt, people in this country have had to put up with an incredible duress in the last 8 years. And they've had to carry an incredible burden. And this burden, another burden on top of it, was not anything that anybody wanted to have. Unfortunately, in my view, bigger, broader policy, national issues did get caught up in that. And with hindsight, I think more could have been done to make the case for payment and the model that was being used, and to explain that we weren't asking people to pay it twice, and that the money that was being paid in water charges was needed to fix the infrastructure. In Arvia, and I'm responsible for the parent company that has responsibility for the operation of Irish Water, we came up short as well. We could have been clearer about how unfit the water infrastructure is, how much was needed to be done to fix that infrastructure, and the scale of the investment that was needed to do that. We could have explained much better how we set up Irish Water in the first place, how we took some of the greatest young Irish talent, coupled it with some of the best international expertise, and built a new, modern Irish utility from scratch in 18 months, at less than half the cost of the international benchmarks. Instead of that, it has been characterised as lavish spending on consultants. In a similar vein, we built a new modern utility. We put a competitive performance pay model in place that was driven by productivity and performance, and we've ended up with it being described as a bonus culture. I strongly reject both of those assertions, and it's something that I would passionately talk and discuss on any forum on any given day, but it's not the topic I was asked to talk about today. So perhaps on another day, in another forum, I would certainly gladly welcome the opportunity to do that. However, we have to accept that our failure to explain these things properly contributed to a broader failure to build a consensus around the need for a transformation of our water and wastewater services, and to need to have this challenge addressed by a single national utility. So having talked a little bit about policy, I'll go back to what I should know more about, which is explaining why this funding is needed and why the change from the old local authority model to having a single national water utility is of critical importance. So let's talk a little bit about the problem. And there is and still exists in this country a view that there was no problem and that there is no problem with our current services. This, to my mind, is a significant issue. Before we will ever get agreement on a solution, we must agree that we have a problem, and we must agree precisely what the problem is. So let me be clear from our perspective in terms of Arvia. We do have a problem with our water services. They are not fit for purpose. And let me give you some facts. It's not that we don't produce enough clean water. We do. Our problem is that we lose 50% of that expensively treated clean water before it gets to our taps through leakage. In 2014, we had 23,000 people in Roscommon who had to boil their water before they could use it. Many of those families had been boiling water for over 7 years. Today, in the last 15 months, we have lifted boil water notice for over 17,000 of those families in just 18 months. But there still remain 6,000 families in Roscommon who will have to boil water for another year, because we need another year to get the next piece of that infrastructure in place. There are 121 water treatment plants in Ireland supplying about 1 million of our citizens that are at risk of contamination every day because they need serious upgrading. More than 1 in every 3 of our water treatment plants have insufficient capacity. That means we are pumping too much raw sewage into them for their ability to treat that sewage, and therefore it can't be treated properly. Our capital city, Dublin, operates with 2% spare capacity. That means our ability to produce water is just 2% more than the demand. And on 3 of the last 4 years, we've actually run out of water in Dublin. We did an economic analysis of this. Every day's water lost in Dublin costs the economy 78 million. 2/3 of our sewer network is in need of repair. And on average, our water infrastructure is twice as old as the European average. And much of our pipework and a lot of our production capacity dates back to the 19th century. Today, we are pumping untreated sewage into 44 locations across the country. We have received as a country a letter of formal notice from the European Court of Justice for continuously and systematically failing to address the issue of pumping raw sewage into our rivers, our lakes and our beaches. We have made commitments to address these issues for many years and have singularly failed to address them. In frustration, the European Union is pursuing Ireland because we have to be forced to clean up and protect our own natural environment. Our utility engineers have gone to Europe in the last 18 months to seek to address this issue and put forward a cogent plan that we can agree with them to show them how it can be addressed. We have been very clear that we cannot deliver on the previous plans that were put forward by Ireland. They are too expensive in our view, and we can't deliver what's been promised in the timescale. But we have put forward a realistic engineering plan that we believe will address these issues sensibly, economically, and in a time frame that's acceptable. And we're very committed to delivering this plan. That's provided we're still around after the next election, I should say. Our water services delivery model is too expensive. It costs twice as much to deliver water services in Ireland as in a similar utility in the UK. We have twice the length of water pipe as a similar utility. And staggeringly, we have 10 times as many water treatment plants in Ireland as an equivalent utility in the UK. We have 856 water treatment plants to provide the water services in this country. The average in the UK utilities is 86. So all of this costs a lot more money than it should, and this is a direct result of delivering water services in a dispersed way through 31 different local authorities. It's not that they're inefficient, it's just a simple lack of economies of scale where you're focused on a small geography and looking at putting the infrastructure in a small confined space rather than looking at it as a national issue. It makes no sense in a country the size of Ireland, with a population the size of Manchester, to have 31 different agencies delivering this kind of infrastructure and services. Our water services and infrastructure are not fit for purpose. They suffer from decades of underinvestment and a lack of a utility approach to planning, operating and maintaining this infrastructure. And there are no quick fixes. It is going to take us years to address this issue, and it requires a multi-billion euro investment programme. I believe it makes most sense to have a single national utility responsible for addressing that challenge. With a single utility, you get a national view on what is needed and how to deliver it efficiently. It provides economy of scale and allows us to reduce much of the duplication and additional costs of a 31 local authority operating model. Since taking over responsibility for water services, at Arvia we've worked with the engineering team within Irish Water to put together a 7-year plan to address the critical challenges that we face as a country. The plan sets out clear goals and targets, and in short, the plan states that by 2021, in 7 years' time, we will have invested 5.5 billion in our water services and our infrastructure. We will eliminate all boil water notices in the country. We will ensure that no wastewater will be discharged without treatment into our waters, our lakes and our beaches again. We will reduce leakage from 50% to 38%. And in the UK, after 20 years, they've managed to reduce leakage to 22%. So the target is not zero, it's not economically viable. But we will bring it down to 38% by 2021. We will improve the water supply capacity for every major urban area so that it meets international best standards in terms of headroom capacity, which is of the order of 15%, not 2% as it is in Dublin. We will, by 2021, have upgraded the 121 water treatment plants that serve over 1 million of our citizens, and we will remove the risk of contamination from their water supply. And we will eliminate the lead services for over 100,000 of our citizens. And in doing all that, we've made a commitment that we will reduce the energy that we use in delivering those water services by 33%. This plan is extremely ambitious and seeks to do in 7 years what many UK utilities have taken over 20 years to do. In short, we require a national transformation programme to address the challenges that we face with our water services. And the reality is that we have not been investing efficiently or sufficiently in our water services. So when people say introducing water charges means we're paying twice, the reality is we've not been paying even once for the water services that we need for our economy and for society. We need more investment, we need it urgently, and this investment has to be paid for in some shape or form by society and by the consumers. And I guess how we pay for water services is the element of this whole debate over the last 18 months that has been most contentious. And there are really only a small number of models. You either pay for it 100% through central taxation, or you get the user to pay for it on the basis of their use, or you find some model which is a mixture of central taxation and user payments, both for business and domestic consumers. We have chosen the latter model, and I do believe that that's the appropriate model for a modern economy, and it is the model that is used in almost all European countries. As a single national utility, then Irish Water is now directly responsible and accountable for water services in Ireland. It must account for its use of funds and show transparently that the monies were used to invest in water services, and demonstrate each year the progress that has been made in fixing our water and our wastewater infrastructure. And unlike additional taxes in order to fund the money that's needed, that goes into central government, domestic charges which are paid directly to the utility, the funding then can be tracked. So it's a bit like from farm to fork. You've got traceability. You can track that funding to show explicitly and directly that every euro that's paid from a consumer's pocket goes directly into the infrastructure that needs to be fixed. If it goes into taxation, it goes into this amorphous blob of funds which will be directed wherever government feels it directed. Where it goes depends on what the policy direction is or what the crisis is that the government needs to fix. By putting it directly into the utility is accountable for it, and you can transparently track, does that money that I paid that utility go to fixing the infrastructure or not? And that can be looked at every year. But however we pay for it, there must be political and public consensus around that choice. And currently, we don't have broad consensus. Utilities invest in long-life, long-term infrastructure to support economic and social development. And to do that, you have to have certainty of funding to make those long-term plans. And it is this lack of clarity that has bedeviled the local government model of funding for water services in the past. The on-off decision-making on exchequer funding makes it impossible to plan with confidence your long-term infrastructure. And that's critical to any utility, and particularly critical to fixing our national water infrastructure. So at Arvia, we are very clear what the engineering and utility solutions are that are needed to fix the water services. We have a very clear plan in place to do it, and we're very clear on the funding that's required to make it happen. But the past 18 months have made it very obvious that it isn't enough if we're going to fix this national problem. For Irish Water to work, we must have political and public support. And it's clear today that not all sections of the public support the concept of a national utility and remain sceptical about it. And it's also clear that there are some political voices that are totally dismissive of it. In many cases, they would state or say they don't believe there's a problem with water services at all, and that they don't think there's a need for a national solution to fix it. I met a politician recently, and he said to me that he'd been drinking tap water all his life and he hadn't been poisoned yet. He doesn't come from Roscommon. He says local authorities have been doing it and doing it fine, and he doesn't see any need for any new approach to these services. So we therefore find ourselves grappling with this question in terms of the title that has been put before our session this evening. How do we ensure the future generations have the right and adequate water supply in an environment where some influential voices don't accept that there's a problem at all, and we certainly don't have political, policy and public consensus, A, about the problem, and a B, about how we fix it? What we need is a long-term commitment to what I believe is a project of national importance. I believe the transformation of our water services and our wastewater services is a project of critical national importance. And I believe that it will impact on the economic and social development of our country for this generation and for future generations. And maybe to finish, I'll go back a little bit for my own history and also our nation's history. I worked in ESB for 28 years. I must update my CV. And the ethos, man and boy, I worked for that company. And the ethos of that company is absolutely rooted in its origins, which is the development of the hydroelectric station in Ardnacrusha and the rural electrification that came from that project. The Ardnacrusha scheme emerged from the first National Strategic Infrastructure Plan made by the newly independent government. It was begun in 1925 and it was completed in 1929 at a cost of £5.2 million. And in case you don't think that's a lot of money, it was 1/5 of the state's total budget in 1925. There was a lot of political controversy over the costs and over what the workers were paid. But back then, the complaint was that they were paid too little. So at least some things have changed. Irish engineers and labourers, under the guidance of Siemens as a consultant, would you believe, harnessed the natural energy of the River Shannon. This project was fundamental to Ireland emerging as a modern society and a modern economy. When it was opened in 1929, the electricity that power plant generated travelled over the new network of high-tension power lines to all households all across the country, some of which were switching on the electric lights, irons and cookers and other modern devices for the first time. It brought the light. I grew up with this, with people who did this rural electrification, and they talked to me about bringing the light. It brought the light to rural Ireland, and it fundamentally changed their lives, because it allowed young people, when they had finished milking cows and doing the chores they did, to come in and study. It allowed them to do their homework, and it was fundamental to creating the educated workforce, which was the backbone of this economy and this society that those previous generations built for us. Ardna Crusha supplied 80% of Ireland's electricity needs in 1935, and is still supplying some of our needs today. Tremendous vision was shown by our political leaders in 1925 in a fledgling Irish state. They were clear what was needed to develop the economic and social well-being of our country, and they set about doing it in the face of incredible criticism and risk at the time. You should read the history of it. You should read the history of the criticism, the white elephant, the abuse they took for having the vision to invest in our future. Ireland today is blessed with a plentiful supply of another finite natural resource, that's water. Harnessing this resource, using it efficiently and returning it to our waterways clean and safe for reuse is core to sustaining this resource for future generations, and I believe core to the fundamental development of our society and our economy. We need a new national vision and a consensus to address the challenges we face with our water services. And I don't want to over-dramatise it, but in terms of what Irish Water is doing. But the €5.5 billion programme of investment is a national vital project designed to give Ireland a safe, world-class supply of a product even more basic than electricity in 1925. It gives us clean water and sanitation. However, I don't believe it can happen properly, and I don't think it can happen as productively and as positively and in the way it should for this nation unless we agree, first of all, that there's a problem, and unless we get consensus, both public and political, that this needs to be addressed. This is a vital national infrastructure project for this generation and for future generations. And if we can just get to that agreement, just get to that solution, we can move on productively to address those challenges for today's generation and future generations. Thank you.